It's a house thing. 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 It's a house thing.
Hello, I'm Heather Hilder-Darling, and on Let's Talk Property today, I have special guests, and I hope there's not going to be too much contention because I have local solicitor, Alex Cook. Now, Alex is going to introduce himself fairly soon, and it's going to be a really exciting programme today. So we're going to talk about property litigation, and also we're going to head over a little bit to talk about compliance and some of the section notices that no doubt you've been hearing about and reading about in the news recently. When we first think about contracts, conveyancing, do you get confused? I certainly do. And, you know, you've got to be really particular with contracts, whether you're a landlord, whether you're a buyer, whichever area in property you are. Have I caught your attention? I'm really pleased because over the next hour, we're going to look at what can go wrong, which may lead to litigation, but also we're hoping that Alex can answer some of the sort of regular questions that we as landlords and possibly sellers come across. So obviously, if you have a property dispute or claim, specialist solicitors can help, but you will need an assessment, advice, guidance, and possibly mediation. So round that off with negotiation, hopefully closure. Property is a complex area of law, and property litigation and dispute resolution can be long-winded and unpleasant. So I'm going to dive straight in right now and say, hello, Alex.
Hi, Heather. Hi there.
How are you doing?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me.
That's wonderful. Lovely to have you on the show. And James, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks, Heather. Yeah, it's good. Hi, Alex.
Hi there, James. Hi.
Wonderful. So first of all, I think we need a little bit of an introduction to Alex Cook. So Alex, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, where you work, how you came to be there, and how long have you been in the business?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, firstly, briefly, completely agree with what you said. And yeah, just in terms of background to disputes and what have you, no doubt we'll come on to all of that good stuff. But myself, I'm a solicitor. I specialise in litigation, really, by which I mean sort of problem solving, to be honest with you. I particularly specialise in commercial disputes, so they can be disputes between companies or perhaps individuals, more often corporate disputes, and obviously property litigation and property disputes, which, you know, it sounds as though that's particularly specialised, but even those two areas are incredibly broad. Again, as perhaps we'll come on to. How long I've been in the business? I think it's probably 12, 13 years, something like that now, possibly 14 years actually. I feel as though the last 18 months has just flown by in a nightmare for many. Yeah, so quite a while. I am a partner at Helix Law. I own the firm together with my business partner. We're a specialist firm of litigation solicitors. We don't do anything else, and we are based in the southeast. How long have we been around? I think it's 10, 12 years, something like that. So forgive me if I'm slightly off there, but it's a fair old while. And I think it's right to say we're one of, if not the largest specialist litigation firms now in the southeast outside of London. So it's been a slow and steady slog to get where we are, but hopefully we continue our growth moving on. And that's us really. So litigation specialist, solicitor. I guess in terms of background, I trained as a barrister, but I never practiced as a barrister, and now I'm a solicitor. So that kind of gives you a steer that I've always been sort of interested in litigation.
The hair is standing up on the back of my neck, Alex. As soon as I hear that word litigation, I come over all peculiar and I think I need a stiff drink. So litigation, is it true that it's becoming more day to day, or is it just that we're hearing a lot more about it because of social media and the internet, etc.?
Sure. I think firstly, don't panic. Okay, it's sort of. I think that it's honest to say that there is this general sort of fear. I guess you could say at a high level there is this sort of tendency or a slight move towards what you might think of being as a kind of an American model where everyone is trying to sue everybody else. Obviously, I look at it slightly differently, and unashamedly have a slightly biased view of this, which I recognise, but. Really, I guess it's kind of, I would like to think people are more aware than ever of their rights and are more willing to hold people to account. I think there's historically, again, I would say, there's perhaps been a tendency to think, solicitors, legal process costs a fortune, takes forever. But actually, all of the information's out there now. And, I think, I don't know about you, but if I get a cold, as I have a slight cold now, I Google it first. And law's not immune to that at all. I go to the GP with a list of all of these horrendous symptoms, and they tell me cut through the chase that it's this, not that, and I breathe a sigh of relief. And I'd like to think that law's no different. So, I think there is a tendency towards a little bit more litigation, but I mean, look, obviously the pandemic has sort of shifted all of this as well. But it may be fair to say, but I hope it's not all bad, Heather. I hope it's not all bad.
Do you think litigation gives a more positive outcome to somebody's issues? So do people feel better if they've won in litigation, or do the other people who've lost feel even worse? Is it a sort of an emotional as well as a...
Do you know, I think it's a really interesting question you've put there. And I think, again, almost treating you as though you were a client, I would say actually, being entirely transparent, I can't give you an assurance of an emotionally satisfying outcome. That's, believe it or not my job. That's not the process in terms of litigation. You may well find that at the end of what can be a long and expensive or tedious process, you are completely dissatisfied emotionally. And again, I sort of transparently, that's not my job. I think this is where there can sometimes be a mismatch between sort of managing expectations and the realities. Most often, I think people litigate because they don't have a choice. And this is something that is overlooked. If you are suffering losses, or say you have a property and you can't do something with, or someone's not delivered as they promised they would, your immediate question is, this is worth a lot of money, invariably, or, it's a particularly big problem. What can I do about that? And so I don't think it's sort of a luxury item as it might be perceived, in the sense of, we've all watched Suits on TV, on Netflix, or, Perry Mason back in the day, what have you, all of that sort of very glamorous stuff. But, it's kind of, I think the nuts and bolts of it are much more practical than that. I don't have a choice. I have to do something about this. And so that's why I say, problem solving, it's our job, I think, to try and position clients to improve their position on the one hand, but really help try and fix their problem. And litigation is only one of the tools that we can use to achieve that. It's not in itself a kind of, I'm going to litigate. It's actually, you've got a problem, I'm going to resolve that problem. And I might have to litigate, but if I can avoid it, if I can negotiate or mediate, as you've said, then I'll look at those options as kind of tools in the armory to help you achieve that.
So really what people are doing is looking for finality, aren't they? They're looking for the end game. It's either right or wrong. And, right or wrong, I'm not sure that's quite the right question. But I think when you get professionals involved, you may see a situation slightly differently to perhaps what you thought was the case. All this is based on case law, presumably. And, unless you follow the laws of the land, then you won't get a conclusion.
I think, again, completely right in saying that. I look at legal costs, and again, it's something that I see a difference between, say, big business and small business or investors, in the sense that, incurring legal costs is an investment, and it's an investment decision as to whether or not you put money behind something. But completely unashamedly, I understand that people want, need, and expect a return on that investment. And it's kind of, again, where this sort of value proposition, it costs a lot of money, yes, but is the return on that investment worthwhile? What are we trying to do here? And I think that's it really needs to be at the forefront of anyone's mind when we're talking about solicitors or legal process or costs and what have you. It's kind of, what's the investment? What does that look like on the one hand? And what's your potential ROI or your return on that investment? And if that stacks up, obviously we look at resolving a problem via litigation or any other mechanism. And if it doesn't, we don't. And that really, I think, is very important, very initial, early doors question to ask yourself, or to be drawing out the answer to that question with your solicitor or legal advisor if you're in that sort of a position.
I mean, this might be a very silly question, but when you're drawing up a budget, perhaps for an investment property, or you're simply buying a new property, or you're going into, the rental services, if you build in a contingency, I mean, I've always been taught just put in a contingency of about 20% to cover any costs or unexpected costs. Do you think people ever think of putting in anything for legal costs in case things go wrong?
I think it very much depends on who it is and, how sophisticated you are or you might be. And sort of, I think at the one end, you might have, say, someone who's, say, inherited a property and they deal with certain things in a certain way. Whereas at the other end, you might have, a portfolio landlord, a company, a fund, a trust, and they deal with things in a very different way. So I think it can vary. There's a huge sort of spectrum there. From my experience, I think actually, say, looking at things like rent guarantee insurance and how that can work as, say, percentage terms can give you a useful barometer. And I know portfolio landlords that, say, used to go in for rent guarantee insurance and they'd pay, 10%, whatever it is on the rent. But actually they've stopped doing that, but they will then keep that money in, say, a fund available if they ever need it. And in that way, they're sort of not incurring the premium, not having the problem of having to deal with an insurer, but still having access to available funds to deal with that. Obviously, you've got to be able to kind of, maintain that, to be honest, because it's very, I think, tempting at different times, challenging circumstances to dip into that. But if you can hold the line on that sort of an approach, then I think it's really sensible. Like any business, it's it really is approaching it in a kind of commercial business way, isn't it? You're not immune from these costs as a landlord or as an investor. You're absolutely in the midst of a business, and you need to act in that way.
Supposing somebody is having problems with a property transaction or a build or whatever it is, what are the three things you would suggest to that person before they actually go into litigation? Litigation is, I would imagine, the final straw. Yeah. So what are the three things you would suggest first and foremost?
Yeah. Well, I think, firstly, I don't think it's a choice as to whether or not you litigate. I think that comes later, sort of further down the line. I think the sort of what we're really talking about here are the precursors to perhaps dipping your head in, or sort of raising your head above the parapet, dipping your toe into the water of getting some legal advice. And I think the kind of, you're not kind of bounding yourself into months or years of litigation and contacting a solicitor. It's kind of, deep breath. We're very happy to have an informal chat. You'll find most solicitors pretty approachable. So hopefully that sort of reassures you immediately that you're not, as I say, locking yourself into litigating. But three things, I guess, shooting from the hip slightly, I would say try and be as clear as you can be on the facts, on the factual position, a chronology of events, what has happened. So often, we can receive almost a digital bin bag of kind of noise and kind of just a lack of certainty, and it just sort of those are the facts. Don't worry about how you present them to me, or I'll work all of that good stuff out. It's but try and have any documents in good order, that sort of kind of admin type stuff. So be as clear as you can on the facts. And I think secondly, I would be saying try and be as clear as you can be on what you're trying to achieve, because if you might come to me and I would say, okay, well, we can do this, we can do that, we can do the other, but all of that is very interesting. But actually, you've got your own plans, and it doesn't really matter what I think, academically or legally, what might be done. It's what you ultimately are looking to achieve. So I think, be as clear as you can on that when you arrive at our door, if you like. And kind of tied in with this, and it might be that this is, I don't know, almost slightly controversial, but try to be a good client. It's sort of, quite often, I think, people, we do charge, okay, and we unashamedly charge for our time, and we charge typically by the hour. And so I think that immediately people, nervousness around that. And I get it as a payer myself in other circumstances. But, try to understand, be as clear as you can with whoever it is that you're dealing with. But, you sort of asking a million questions or calling me every day or, chasing, etc. It's a balance. It's a relationship of trust and confidence, and it's on me partly to reassure you, which I completely get. But let me do my job. It's kind of, that's the flip. So try and be a good client in whatever you do. And I guess the third thing I would say is, whatever you're doing, I would say look for a specialist. Be as clear as you can be on costs. meaning your budget and whatever it is they're going to charge you, so funding. And also be clear on service levels. I think this is something that can be overlooked in the sense that, people say, what's your hourly rate? Oh, your hourly rate's expensive. But really the question is, how many hours is it going to take? Are you going to pick up the phone when I call? Is that important to you? So price is one variable. A bit like, anyone, any industry, are sort of not all solicitors are the same, and that I think is something that people might not necessarily be aware of or experienced in. So try and look for specialists, build a relationship with people, and be clear on costs and funding, because that's incredibly important.
James, I think what Alex has just been explaining very much resonate with what we do in estate agency. Is that true?
Yes, God, there was so much covered there, Alex. I particularly like your digital bin bag explanation. Yeah, that's a new one on me. I've written that one down. I love it. And that comes from I know that comes from people's good intentions, and it's good that people keep a trail of stuff, but so many people don't keep the trail of stuff. And I think that is where you talked about earlier about, being very clear and having clarity about what the problem is. But I think, from a private rented sector perspective, I think people are definitely know their rights a lot more now, and they've got a lot more resources to have a touch point to. But unfortunately, sometimes it's not always accurate, because within our sector we have lots of different legislation, which also then have transitional periods where you have got two different pieces of legislation almost running alongside each other, and that confuses people in a big way. And it is all about communication, and it is all about trying to find out what both parties really want to achieve out of whatever they are going into dispute about. And I have to say, during the COVID period, we've got absolutely loads of brilliant examples where landlords and tenants have really come together to try and find the best way through for both people's circumstances. And I think there's been some really good examples in the industry. And it is a shame, because I think there's still a lot of negativity around how bad a landlord is. And actually, the landlords are providing an absolutely vital service within our society, where the government and the private, the social sector are actually failing, and we need both parties in this transaction to make it work long term. And I think mediation, Alex touched on mediation, I think that is definitely something that needs to happen. I think there's a lot more movement towards people mediating a lot earlier on, so that it doesn't have to go to fully fledged litigation, which people then have to make a commercial decision on, because ultimately, there's a trade-off between the cost involved versus what is going to be the end result for all parties. So I think there's some brilliant work going on, and actually I think a lot of the negativity that our industry gets is actually a distraction. It's a convenient distraction from a government perspective to bash the sector, because it means that it's almost deflecting from some of their shortcomings in providing the correct housing because not everybody should be in the private rented sector, and that's also a problem that landlords are faced with, dealing with people that are misplaced. And it's a whole different skill set, and this is where conflict comes in, and this is where lack of understanding comes in. And before you know it, there's a lot of anger if you're not careful. So there's lots of good things going on. I do try to keep bashing on about all the good things, because I think there's too many people wanting to, talk down the good work that's happening. There's loads more work to be done, but there's work to be done on both sides, so that we don't go into these litigation situations.
You're totally right, James.
Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. Just so much of that I can absolutely subscribe to. It's one of the dangers with the internet that we sort of just touched on earlier, just about noise. There's an awful lot of noise out there in terms of not only the detail of the legal position or what people might think the legal position is, but if particularly on notices and things, if you miss one aspect, you're absolutely sunk at the moment. And then separately on the kind of the brand landlord versus tenants, I don't agree with that narrative at all. I think it's a real shame. Landlords need tenants, and without tenants they don't have a business, and without landlords and tenants don't have accommodation. So it just everything should be as one, but there is this slight perception of us versus them, which is really unfortunate.
Radio Reverb. Play something to it.
It's a shame, really, because
Yeah, it's not,
there's been
it's not
several.
healthy.
Sorry, James. Did you want to say something?
I was just agreeing. It's not healthy, that narrative. Yeah.
No. It's really odd, actually, because there's a lot of sort of campaigns going on social media about being kind and spread kindness. Well, actions have to follow the words, don't they? And I think what we're talking about now, we all three of us agree that there's a lot of good going on, but it's a bit like bad news always seems to come above good news, which is terrible, really. Alex, can I ask you, do you think that people have become less tolerant, or what's happened during lockdown especially, do you think?
I think it's really interesting, and James touches on this as well, in the sense that generally my perception, and I say professionally in the context of our work, I think landlords and investors have been and continue to be remarkably patient. I think an awful lot of people are at the moment in difficult circumstances. Okay, there's real uncertainty out there surrounding the pandemic and jobs and incomes and lockdowns, and we've got all of that baggage coming through. I have experienced an awful lot of landlords who are basically sat on portfolios, properties with significant arrears at the moment, but who are not necessarily taking proactive steps other than speaking with the tenant, trying to encourage, say, payments by instalment or something to sort of reduce the impact. But generally, they've been pretty, I wouldn't say slow, but just they're not necessarily pushing the go button on, say, issuing claims or even notices. So I think there's been an awful lot of flexibility carried by people. And I think in that sense, there's a lot of tolerance out there. I kind of anecdotally, I don't know if you guys agree, but I think one of the risks of everything that has happened in the last year is that, we're all carrying a kind of a hangover, in the sense that I think service levels generally in a lot of business have gone down, my experience. And so I hope that landlords, investors and property are bucking that trend, through what I've said. I think, again, hopefully it has aided communication between them. It's kind of a pulling together type atmosphere. And I hope that that's not sort of diluted in the coming kind of months as things, perhaps we hope, go back to a high degree of normality. But yeah, I think people have been incredibly tolerant, particularly landlords.
I think we feel as though we've been walking on eggshells a little bit, because that terrible word harassment that comes up in so many cases, if you want to speak to your tenants about non-payment of rent, fortunately we have successfully agreed between some landlords and tenants, payment structures, and generally I would say it's been 100% successful. But when you're not sure and the goalposts keep changing about when you can evict, when you can serve a notice, it's terribly complicated, and trying to keep up with all that with the changing dates. Would you agree, James?
Yes, I actually think that it's set up to fail. I think they're just looking for, it's a tick box exercise that when it does get in front of a decision maker, i.e., the judge or whoever is making the decision, will just look for something that's not quite right, and you don't always have enough time to actually always prove it. But I actually, we have had a really good success rate in terms of negotiating rent issues during the COVID situation. And, I can honestly say that we actually haven't had a landlord serve notice on a tenant, even now that the notices are being reduced now down to 4 months. Landlords are working with tenants to make it work. And so I think that there is a lot to be said for that. But when you do get to that stage of doing it, there is how a landlord does that themselves, who are managing the process themselves, who are not engaging a professional letting agent and are not using a solicitor potentially to look over the notices. I don't know how. I've yet to see how that's going to actually unfold, because there is so much that they could expose themselves to, and actually they'll end up probably having the case probably deferred while they have to go sort out their paperwork. So my advice to anybody that's listening that is self-managing this part of the process, there's a whole part of the lettings process now, in my opinion, that needs to be run in a professional capacity. But when you are looking to serve any type of notice, you cannot cut corners. What you might save in not paying someone to do it is absolutely pennies compared to what potentially you're going to lose if you're not doing it properly.
Absolutely. So just to sort of round off that first section, Alex, if you could wave a magic wand now and improve or change one thing about the process of litigation, what would it be and why?
Wow. I mean, yeah, incredibly. I mean, this is a conversation in itself, Heather, to be honest with you. You know, the number of things that you might, I might mention here. But I guess I sort of, if I take a high level, you know, my aim, I think, and I think this is a shared aim generally, is to encourage investment in property, okay? Because I think we need more housing and everyone seems to be agreed in that. But nobody really seems to want to pay for it. And yet here we have a sector in terms of private landlords who are they've already got skin in the game. So it might sound slightly perverse, this, but I would make eviction claims much more straightforward. I'd make the process quicker. I'd make it simpler. That will aid people trying to deal with it themselves. It will actually perversely aid tenants because it will increase the amount of investment in the sector, which will then increase the amount of supply, which should, in theory, at least in my mind, decrease rents. So it may sound weird, but I would try and make the eviction process quicker and easier, simpler. The second thing, and I start getting a little bit more technical, I guess, in this sort of answer, but I would absolutely start allowing costs recovery, including against government or whoever it might need to be, where legal aid is being used, but the case is then lost. And this is a slight nuance. You may not be aware of this, but tenants in housing claims can qualify for legal aid. And we do see this, particularly where disputed or discretionary notices are used. And ultimately, the big loss here is time, okay? Landlords will still go on and they'll win, in inverted commas, but a little bit like our conversation earlier, that will not feel like a win because the landlord will have spent a lot longer in obtaining the outcome, and they will obviously have incurred costs in getting to that outcome. And yet, where a tenant is funded by legal aid, the landlord cannot recover those costs. And I find that really difficult to justify. To explain that to a landlord at the very outset is nigh on impossible. So I would absolutely look at that. As far as I'm concerned, if a case is lost, somebody somewhere should be paying for that. Because, of course, it would then act as a disincentive to defend unreasonably unfairly. So I'd absolutely be looking at that. And I guess I'm a little bit on the fence about mediation. I really like mediation in commercial disputes. I think it works. There is obviously an awful big push, you may not be aware, but there's a big push to kind of advocate more mediation between landlords and tenants. Why I love it is that it's a great way to resolve problems. If you can mediate a resolution, you don't need to litigate, you don't need to incur costs and take the time. Fantastic. Everyone's a winner, quite literally. Where I think it's a problem potentially in property is that fundamentally landlords do try to resolve issues already. And I think it would be naive to think that landlords are there just firing off notices and issuing claims. It may fit a certain narrative, but in this us versus them type world that I touched on earlier. But the reality is that's not what I see. I see landlords who have tried already. And so in adding in mediation, you're kind of adding in potentially another hurdle that everyone has to kind of jump over. So I'm a little bit nervous about that. But I think probably along similar lines, what I would look at implementing would be a situation where if a tenant promises to leave, they can't then renege on that. Because at the moment, that's one of the difficulties from a landlord's perspective. If a tenant says, I'm going to go in a month, you start planning, you might have viewings, you might have works arranged, etc. But actually, that's not legally binding. And if the tenant turns around a couple of days beforehand when you're saying, can I turn up and collect the keys? What have you doing the inspection? And they say, oh, actually, sorry about that. We've changed our mind. You have absolutely no legal recourse at all. And again, that seems to me to be really confused. We should be bound by what we say and what we promise. And I think that at the moment, there are no consequences to that for tenants. And there does have to be a little bit more give and take on this. So I would look at something along those lines in terms of, if we were to wake up tomorrow and all of that good stuff were happening.
So you don't just want one magic wand, Alex. You want one for every day of the working week, don't you?
Come on. I mean, we're here just talking about possession claims. I need multiple. Let's do this, Heather.
Okay. Hello. If you've just tuned in to Radio Reverb 97.2 FM and DAB, you're listening to Let's Talk Property with Heather Hilder-Darling. My guests today are Alex Cook of Helix Law and James Duffy, the compliance guru at Callaway's Residential Sales and Lettings. Now, what I think we'll do now is we'll move over to discussion around landlord and tenants, eviction notices, Section 21, so Section 8s even, and of course the other highly emotive subject of bailiff enforced evictions. So, Alex, can we start with your take on Section 21 notices?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, look, first things first, a Section 21, for those that don't know, this is a no-fault notice. So I'm a landlord, you're the tenant, I'd like the property back, I'm serving a notice. Now, again, Heather, as you mentioned earlier, these notice periods, for very understandable reasons, I think, but they've been all over the place in the last 18 months. They've been up the number of months, they're now back down again. They were at 2 months pre-coronavirus, they're now at 4 months. So that's where we are right now. I would say to anybody, we're in a very fluid situation here. It looks as we're speaking as though we're heading to the end of lockdown, what have you, and God willing, that will continue. But at the same time, I think you have to sort of understand the position as and when you're serving a notice, and that's incredibly important because really we receive ourselves almost no sort of prior notice of changes in the law in this area. It has been incredibly sort of fluid at different times, as it's needed to be. But at the moment, Section 21's no fault notice, 4 months. There is, in this Parliament, a plan to remove Section 21 notices as a method of giving notice to a tenant in property. Fundamentally, I think that's bad news for tenants. I think it's bad news for landlords, but it is what it is. And we have to sort of play to the rules of the game, whatever they are. So at the moment, 4 months notice. I think the key thing with this, if anyone's looking at a Section 21 notice, which is a Form 6A, very straightforward notice on its face value, it's pretty straightforward. But the killer is in what's not in that document itself. And that's to make sure that it's actually valid, okay? Because if you look at it, it really, you think, my goodness, this is straightforward. Of course I can do that. But where people come unstuck is where they try and have a go themselves. And unfortunately, they may not have ticked all of the boxes that nobody mentions that must be ticked. And I say must, there's no discretion on this. If you don't tick these boxes before you serve this notice, that notice will not be valid. And there's no discretion, there's no, but it's only a blah, blah, blah. It just doesn't apply. It's not going to be valid. And you're back starting the clock again on your 4 month notice. So prerequisites, what am I talking about? EPC, make sure the deposit's registered, make sure the prescribed information in full, not just the certificate, any licensing. There are any number of these different prerequisite requirements that you must have dealt with as a landlord before you serve this notice. And as I say, it's the kind of sucker blow where people have said, come along, oh, look, a notice, here it is. And I'm immediately twitching. My spider sense, it's kind of telling me, have a look at the detail on these, as we must. And, invariably you'll have a look. And unfortunately, the deposit information was served a little bit late, or it was after the notice, or just these minor issues on their face. But because of that, it's not valid. And so we have to start the process again. And so be very careful about that, I would say. So Section 21's a no fault notice, currently 4 months.
That's ringing lots of bells, isn't it, James?
Yes. Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier, in terms of the tick box exercise that people need to make sure they know what they're doing and they've got all the paperwork. I mean, you can't tick it if you haven't done it throughout the tenancy or before the tenancy. So it is so important people are aware of all these steps they have to take should they need to serve notice at the end, because people don't think necessarily about the way in the future, but they have to think about that at the beginning. Yeah.
And I think that's what concerns us about landlords who say, oh, no, I can do that myself, I can manage it myself, but they're away perhaps for 6 months of the year, or they've got Auntie Flo who can pop round and check things out. To us, that's an absolute no, don't do it that way, isn't it? You're just leaving yourself open, to disputes further along the line. But so let's move on to Section 8 notices now, Alex. So getting it right from the outset, what difference will it make? If the Section 21's go and we can use a Section 8 notice, how is that going to make it clearer to our tenant that they have to go?
Well, I mean, the reality is they're both notices seeking possession. I don't think these are, from my perspective, I don't think a Section 8, there's no plan on removing a Section 8. There is currently kind of very loose talk around amending the Section 8 regime. So A Section 8 notice requires particulars or grounds to support that notice. And so typically a ground will be, say, the property's in disrepair, or there might be antisocial behaviour, or most common is rent arrears. So again, these are different grounds that are triggered that you then use to support the Section 8. There is talk that with the removal of Section 21s, there will be additional grounds added, including, for example, I'm the landlord, I would like to move back into the property. But again, I'm a little bit concerned on behalf of actually everybody involved in property, including tenants, at the lack of detail around this as we sit here, because it's kind of, we do have certainty that Section 21s are going. We don't have certainty as to what they're going to be replaced with. And I think all of that just creates inherently uncertainty, which makes it very unattractive in terms of really getting involved in letting property. And so I think you're absolutely right earlier in saying that, if you are involved in this industry, you've got to be absolutely on top of this stuff from the very outset. I don't like advising landlords and investors to rely on Section 8s as things stand right now. But in a world where you may not have any choice, it's just more fundamental than it ever has been that you are absolutely on top of all of this, not least because Section 8s take a lot longer as matters stand. Section 21s give you access to what's known as the, in inverted commas, don't shoot the messenger, accelerated possession route claim. Whereas Section 8 notices are more, in my world, vanilla type claims for possession of land. And that can be incredibly broad. It might be, say, owners who are in dispute. So it really is in a different kind of category that Section 8s kick in. I think the average turnaround time for Section 8 claim pre-coronavirus was 12 months. So that gives you an idea of what you're into if you are a landlord having to issue a claim. It's a lot longer. And so it's kind of, oh, well, we won't worry, Section 21s are going, we'll still have Section 8s. I think that's the wrong view, the wrong analysis.
Mm-hmm. And I suppose the worst case scenario is when you've got the bailiff enforced evictions. I mean, I can remember as a child hearing things about all the bailiffs are coming, and it used to be for like non-payment of HP and things like that. But it just sends a shiver down my spine. So how has that changed over the last 18 months?
Well, first things first, I think the number of bailiff evictions in the last 18 months has been at historic lows. Okay, they just haven't happened. They have been suspended, they've then been delayed, the delay has been extended, and I don't think many people can take issue with that. It's understandable. We've had a lot going on, and there are other things to deal with, and I get that. So I think that sort of if we just park the last 18 months to one side, you at the moment have two options, and let's just set the scene here. This is the context where landlords have been forced to issue claims. They've then had to go through the court process. That has taken months. They've incurred costs. The court has found in their favour. So in other words, you're the landlord. You're absolutely right. I'm a judge. I'm agreeing with you. You're entitled to your property back. Someone's done something wrong here, or they've not gone when they should have. They've still not gone. So they've now ignored a court order. What's your remedy then? Well, as you've already indicated, it's either via county court bailiffs, which are employed by the courts, or in the alternative, it's high court enforcement officers. And I think, again, that they are self-employed. There are different processes that you can look at depending on the circumstances. Much of a muchness at the moment. Why does this happen? I think was one of your questions then, Heather. And I think, from my perspective, invariably, one of the reasons is that local authorities to rehouse a tenant will not simply do so where you as the landlord or the tenant even in the property presents the possession order. They will actually require the landlord to go further. They require you to apply to the court for a bailiff to arrange an appointment. And it's only when you have a bailiff's appointment and a date, they start kicking in the process of securing alternative accommodation. Now, again, technically, procedurally, is that right? Should that be happening? I can't answer that. That's a policy point. I'm not, here to sort of answer those sorts of questions. But I can absolutely say that practically that's what happens on the ground. We work in courts up and down the country. They will require a bailiff's appointment to be arranged. And it's just so frustrating, disappointing, I think. But it is what it is. So, again, that could be something that has changed. But it's the reality as we sit here right now.
This is the world of Radio Reverb.
The problem is as well, we can't have people, sleeping on the streets because they can't find somewhere to go. And this evolves further with there aren't enough houses, there's not enough social housing. And we had that conversation earlier on this year with Citizens Advice. It's not just for one body to sit down and talk about it. There are so many people that feed into this industry for providing housing, whatever kind it is, whether it's private or renting or social. So I do understand the problems here. Now, just to get... obviously, we don't have much to do with the Ministry of Justice getting the data, but I'd love to hear some numbers. I love numbers. So if you could give us some numbers on the sort of claims that are going forward, maybe the numbers of people that have actually received a Section 21, or the numbers of landlords who really do want to keep them, or even how perhaps tenants, people like as tenants associations who are almost not ganging up on landlords, but are really trying to counter all the actions on behalf of landlords, just to get a flavour of what's going on behind the scenes.
No, I get it. I mean, look, Ministry of Justice, it all sounds a bit Judge Dredd, doesn't it? Kind of all a bit serious suddenly. But so I mean, look, the Ministry of Justice, deep breath, they release quarterly statistics. And I mean, look, I've had a look, they bundle in mortgage possessions and possession claims by landlords. But I think the big takeaway here is these claims have fallen off a cliff. Okay, they were already historically low. And I say that, sort of in general terms, okay? But you're already looking at it. Let's just sort of briefly talk about pre-coronavirus, okay? I think it was right in saying that in comparison to the most recent English housing survey, the number of possession claims in percentage terms, it was something like 1% of landlords needed to issue a claim. Okay, so I think the perception of the fear versus the reality is, it's not quite at the level that is being pitched in the marketing or the media of different organisations. This is not, tens of thousands of people about to be bundled onto the street. We don't do that here, and I'm grateful that we don't. But I think, again, we just have to take a step back, and that's where hopefully some data can help us. But then, of course, we hit coronavirus. And, in this year, if you like, from, I think I'm right in saying January and also September, October, there was some loosening as well of 2020. But, as of January of this year, generally claims are proceeding and everything is, in inverted commas, back to a degree of normality in the claims process, the possession claims process. But even now, you look at the number of claims has decreased on already those low levels of 1% by 74%. So, I kind of, again, I don't know if you guys sort of would agree with this, but I was reading, we were obviously in the largest lockdown, the first lockdown, I think, last year, and everything was suspended. And there was talk towards the end of that lockdown of, this avalanche of claims coming through. And we can now see in the data that just has not happened. It's never materialized, including now up to March this year. That's the most recent data available. So claims are down quarter on quarter sort of view, 74%. And this follows through the different stages. So possession orders on those claims are down by 72%. Again, massive numbers in percentage terms. Warrants, which means sort of bailiff attendances, if you like, and repossessions are down in the region of 80 to 96% in comparison to last year, the same period. And I just, again, I think it's just, they're so significant, these numbers. They can't be ignored. And we have to say to ourselves, what's that all about? From my perspective, anecdotally, if you like, the business that we're in, dealing with landlords and agents, etc., and investors really up and down the country, the reality is I think there are a lot of landlords who are still negotiating, agents trying to watch their backs, basically, in negotiating resolution and avoiding these problems happening. But I think that there is some pent-up demand, if you like, and people are still trying to negotiate directly as they should. But I do think there's a degree to which we're going to see these numbers invariably increase. We should be prepared for that because they are crazy speaking low. I mean, incredibly low. So that's where we're at right now. And it does tell a story.
Well, I'd like to speak up for some of the landlords that we deal with. You know, obviously, when we send out renewal notices about what you could be charging for your property, and the majority, in fact, almost 100% have said to me, no, it's been an incredibly difficult 18 months for everybody. We're going to leave the rent as it is. And that's the humanity story of it all, I think, where, you know, we have to go back to who we are and what we're doing and look at things on behalf of everybody. So I think that speaks volumes, actually, for the landlords that are out there understanding what tough times have been. Would you agree, James? I think, you know, that says a lot, doesn't it, when people really take that point of view. It's not all about getting the most that you can for your property. I'm just amazed at those figures that you've just given to us. Absolutely amazed.
Just to answer your question, I would agree with you. I did say this earlier on, that's my experience as well. And I think, obviously, as an industry, we do have to deal with whichever landlords who are choosing to abuse any particular situation they can abuse, when they're trying to be unreasonable in a tenancy. But on the whole, our experience has been that they want to, you know, make it work. Some of those figures, Alex, are, you know, really do tell a picture. And I think that some of the decisions or policy decisions that might be being made in up and down the country are maybe being based on some other factors and I hope they start to read some of this more up-to-date live data before they make any future decisions, because my view is that we need to embrace and incentivize the very good landlords that we have up and down the country, and deal with the landlords who aren't sticking to the legislation. There's enough laws and there's enough things in place to deal with them already. But rather than hitting everybody with this stick, you know, tenants need these places to live, and we don't want any more exiting the market because it's now an unattractive situation, because ultimately landlords have got an awful lot of responsibility. There was a lot, I mean, not a lot of people like us touched on this particular subject, but there was obviously this discussion during COVID where obviously landlords did get a potential payment holiday, but that actually isn't something that they don't have to pay back. That they are accruing debt, and I know a lot of landlords that didn't take that holiday. They just carried on weathering the storm when their tenants couldn't pay, because ultimately that has a knock-on effect at the end of their term, or if they need to refinance. And people might say, oh, well, you know, they're in what they call a fortunate position. But if without these landlords, more tenants are going to have less places to live. And so we've got to really have a balance here.
That's an excellent point, actually, James. And you can't believe it. We're nearly finished. We've nearly come to the end of the show. So actually, that opens the doors for Alex to tell me what he would do if he became Secretary of State for Justice and Lord Chancellor tomorrow morning. So
lucky me.
Yeah, lucky you. What would your first 3 steps be to make litigation more straightforward and accessible?
I think, look, particularly with a focus on property, as we've discussed, I would absolutely make the process more straightforward for everybody. Okay, we really need to encourage this inward investment. So whatever that looks like in terms of notices, all of this complexity, the lack of discretion, the fact that it's so rigid and inflexible, I think all of that needs to go away and be altered. So I'd absolutely make the evictions claims process more straightforward for landlords and actually clear, if you like, for tenants too. As I mentioned, I think earlier touched on, I'd absolutely be allowing cost recovery, because I just think at the moment you've got too much incentive to defend with a spurious defence that actually lacks any momentum or substance. And that's just wrong. You know, that snares up the court process, drags this whole thing out. I think finally, really, I would be shifting this burden on having to ever even contemplate litigation or issue claims. You know, the local authority have a statutory duty to rehouse people who are being properly and correctly evicted, where, say, the property that they're in is being sold or what have you, whatever it might be. And the truth of it is, it's a complete waste of public money and resources for claims to be necessary in this area. You know, it really isn't necessary in an awful lot of cases. So I'd be encouraging local authorities to step in earlier. And by the way, I recognise how difficult that is for local authorities. It's why I also add in the making evictions easier to try and encourage more inward investment by private individuals. I think that is a massive part of the solution to the housing crisis here. We can't be just relying on local authorities. So those are the steps that I'd take. As controversial as they might seem, it's all geared around trying to help both landlords and tenants.
I think they're very good points, Alex. And obviously, we've only really scraped the surface of everything around property and litigation. So I think it's actually left us with more to talk about, possibly in another show. But thank you so much for joining us. But if anybody has got any property problems or disputes that they'd like resolved, where do they get hold of you?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me, Heather. Really appreciate that, and I'm always happy to speak with you. In terms of the best way to get hold of me, you can either check our website, which is www.helix-law.com, or in the alternative, you can send me an email. That's alphacharlie@helix-law.com.
And are you on any social media at all?
Oh, I am. I'm on all of them. You can find me. I can't hide, unfortunately. I try and hide. I'm not going to read those out. If you want to add me, add
That's
me.
okay.
And,
I think we'll find you. Don't worry. I'm sure we'll find you. James, thank you for your contribution today as well. I think there were some really important points brought up. So thank you for joining me today on Let's Talk Property, Radio Reverb 97.2 FM and DAB.
It's a house thing. 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 It's a house thing.